Welcome, folks, to our webinar on improving economic accessibility. Why have a tech subsidy in your organization? I'm Stephanie Johnson, and I'm here with my colleague, Carrie Duncan. So I am the co-founder and executive director of Oldlin, and I am one of the project leads uh, on the Women and Gender Equality Canada grant that we have received. Um, I will pass it to, I'll pass it to Carrie.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks so much for coming. My name's Carrie and my pronouns are they, them. And I'm the project coordinator for the Digital Inclusion for 2S LGBTQIA organizations project that we have funded through WAGE. And I'm joining from Niagara and get to connect with you all through this digital space we have. So great.
Great. And so just a little bit about Oldland before we begin. We want to see Canadian 2S LGBTQ communities grow and thrive in the digital age through safe, accessible, and inclusive digital spaces. And our primary mission is to transform organizational approaches to digital inclusion and participation. We do this by conducting research, developing training materials, and curating high quality resources from across the web. And we work with 2S LGBTQI plus organizations to facilitate access to essential technology and provide them with comprehensive training on digital tools and resources, digital safety and best practices so they can empower their staff and their clients. And then we also empower organizations that may not primarily serve 2S LGBTQI plus communities, but want to create more inclusive, safe, and accessible digital programming and services. Before we begin, we will do a land acknowledgement. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have longstanding relationships with the territories where Oldlands volunteers and partners are located, and we acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area where we primarily work, known as Tekaronto, has been carried by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region. We always encourage folks to learn more about the land that they are on, and you can do that by visiting nativeland.ca. And we always like to highlight initiatives that focus on supporting Indigenous communities. So Inspire is a really great charity that provides education to Indigenous communities across Canada. Uh, Oldland's team has grown a lot over the last year, and while I am located in Tekaronto, many of us are in different regions. And Oldland acknowledges that colonization and white supremacy have created the social conditions that sustain inequality and marginalized 2S LGBTQI plus people, even in digital spaces. Oldland stands in solidarity with Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island against settler colonial violence in so-called Canada. We recognize that the digital divide is part of this ongoing colonization, and digital access and safety for all cannot be achieved until Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island have full access to digital spaces. Oldland stands firm in our conviction that digital safety and accessibility remain fundamental to this broader project of decolonization. So our agenda today is pretty simple. We're going to talk about our technology subsidy pilot program. We're going to talk about how you can implement that program into your organization, and then we will have open Q&A. Carrie, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, so along with the excitingness of the program, another exciting aspect is we got to do an article with Pink Triangle Press that got published in the digital version of Extra Magazine. So I'll just link that in the chat. But we were able to work with one of their freelance writers to showcase the tech subsidy and share with him the ways that to get this out even further. And so today we're going to be talking about um, how tech subsidies are essential for looking at economic justice and to us LGBTQIA digital spaces, and really thinking through how this is a practical, hands-on way to be fostering digital inclusion. So we're super grateful for this article, and we want people to read it and share it with your networks and post it on all your platforms. So it's linked there, and we'll link it when we send out the recording. And just, yeah, share this as far as you can, because it was a really great privilege to get to do the article with him.
So we this past year we piloted a technology subsidy program through our wage funding. Um, this is part of our project Digitally Empowering 2S LGBTQI plus organizations. The purpose of the pilot project was to alleviate digital access barriers by providing financial support for technology related expenses. So for us, it was really an opportunity to ensure that our volunteers can fully participate in working online with us and that they would thrive in the roles um, that they are in. So I'll pass it to Carrie.
Yeah. And so the tech subsidy is one of my favorite parts of my job because it puts into action what we talk often gets talked about in theory. So a tech subsidy is a tangible way to implement and expand accessibility. So especially with in-person settings or events, we think about things like ramps, we think about things like signage, we think about things like accessible washrooms as a way of participating. But especially being in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and also just people have worked online for as long as online has been here. It's important that we look at accessibility in a digital sphere. And so initially we think about things like captioning, we think about multilingual tools, but we also have to think about the resources it takes to implement and participate in an online setting. And so this could be like having up-to-date devices is an essential accessibility step. It could be having headphones that like cut out background noise so you can better focus. It could be offsetting an internet bill, which we'll get into a little bit more, but accessibility looks a lot of ways, and thriving participation is not just the ability to be present, but actually engage and feel confident in our spaces. And so a big part of that is offsetting the financial impacts. Access to the internet is not a default. And even though many devices will log in, not everyone has internet in their home. I know I grew up without internet in my home, so I had to walk to the public library. And so if, say, you need childcare, like that's part of this financial impact of participating. And so when we're thinking about financial accessibility and economic accessibility, this is one way we could be tangibly encouraging participation. Also, having tech subsidies it's not just like for your volunteer base, it's not just for your upper management. This is a tool that can be used across different roles in different parts of your organization. And so, especially when I think about like a larger nonprofit, for example, this is a pretty essential equity-based tool that means that maybe your interns all the way up to your top like executive team could be benefiting and engaging and better participating and being valued. And so when we think about access to certain tools, we tend to think about only certain roles, but the quantity of time people get called in for a Zoom meeting or have to deal with their email, these are all things that are going to eventually incur financial cost and be part of various parts of your organization. So it allows you to engage in that way. Also, when we think about disability, for example, one thing we know for sure is that no one person's needs are always going to look the same, if ever. And that's the same with 2S LGBTQIA folks. Everyone's going to have different accessibility needs. And instead of being like, everyone gets an iPad or everyone gets access to this thing that we think could work for you. This allows people to direct their own needs and communicate that with your organization. This creates a model of confidence building and independence that overall would fosters like greater team building because we're valuing people for where they're at and we're not prescribing to them what they think is accessibility, what we think is accessibility. And then finally, we have to also account for external factors, which I kind of mentioned before. We know 2S LGBTQIA communities are faced with a whole range of systemic discrimination, especially when we look at older generations or rural communities. Um, we can't solve a rural community's access to the internet. However, we could help offset the cost someone might need to get internet in their home or get a better set of headphones so that they could focus on participating. There's a lot of external factors that when we think about accessibility, um, we're not always thinking about the like bigger picture and the bigger picture of participation. And so having tools like a tech subsidy creates like a consideration for those larger factors. And so if we want to look at inclusion, not just as something we have as a checkbox on a grant application, not just a tokenistic thing, but something we actually are practically engaged in, which I know all the people who registered for today's session are. I know here at Oldland we are. These are things we want to see tangibly changed, and the tech subsidy is one way to be able to do that. Yeah. And so in addition to the practical approaches to inclusivity, this also helps mitigating with digital divide barriers. People are in different positions in their experience with digital literacy. And the more accessibility built by online spaces, potential also exclusion we're seeing. And so if we want to have people of different levels of digital literacy, different access points to both internet access and digital literacy access, we need to have the tools at our disposal to make that happen and be prepared when people aren't able to engage to help them solve those problems. Also, another benefit is it improves the overall work experience and retention. If people feel valued, if they feel like their resource, time, energy are something that you're invested in, they're going to give that back to you. And it creates a level of commitment from the team and engagement where uh, people aren't as stressed trying to fit another thing into their day, another committee or another webinar, but they're like, oh, I am valued in this space. And this has been shown through the reciprocity of these resources. And so then you see people coming back because then you build up a reputation of like, oh, we take this seriously. We take the energy and commitment that you put into this much more seriously. And overall, from a financial perspective, for all the grant writers and EDs in the out there in the audience, it really does matter because you're going to be saving money in the long term. So for like obviously the priority is around practical inclusion, and we can talk about this as a money saver because you're not going to be seeing people going to a different organization who might have this resource. You have that here, and so they're going to stay committed in their roles. Um, and then the final piece is we know most places are moving to hybrid models for a whole range of accessibility reasons, and we really see the positive in that. And this allows for that type of hybrid community that's like not just like awkward Zoom like on mute, but actual like active participation between the in-person and online participants, which the more of that, the like we will see even greater participation.
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, and what I've seen with like more practically with how this has benefited individuals who've received tax subsidies funds, it's allowed them to um, be more at ease with working online, knowing that they don't have to, pay out of pocket to buy something that is essential for them to do their work, such as a pair of headphones or a webcam or um, like a new mouse or a new tablet, which this this fund offsets. Yeah. So uh, now we're going to talk about implementing a technology subsidy program, how you can actually integrate it into your organization and build it into um, your projects. So you want to, so these are a few of the key considerations. You want to include it in your budget. It might be something that you can include in your annual operation funds, or it might be something that's included in a project budget. In our case, we built it into our wage budget for the project that we have. And so the longevity of that is for the duration of the project itself. But our intention is to build it into our core operation costs so that it is continuously offered to our staff, volunteers, and anyone else who contributes to Oldland in the future. Since we were piloting this initiative, our initial approach was to build it into a grant and to get the funder to support the initiative. It was the first time that Wage had seen um, this kind of initiative piloted within one of their grants. They had a few questions about it, but once we explained it, uh, they thought it was a great uh, addition to what we were doing in order to build our capacity. You want to decide again how long you're going to be offering it for and how long you can sustain it for. And then define eligibility requirements. So who's going to be able to receive this fund? How do they access it? Etc. Um, and then there's the oversight piece, which Carrie, did you want to elaborate on that?
Just in terms of the back and forth around receipts.
Yeah.
Yeah, so with the oversight, one thing that we found that we just had to think through was, are we going to require people send us like a quote for something ahead of time, or could they purchase something and then provide us the receipt, or could they ask us for approval first and then go buy it and then provide the receipt? And so the way we implemented it was we left it pretty broad so people could apply for everything from like portion like to cover tech equipment or a portion of tech equipment or bills and we worked with the people participating to really figure out what that looked like. So in some cases, people needed to make a larger purchase, and so they wanted to know ahead of time if the cost would be offset. And that worked out great. In other cases, people sent previous internet bills, like a PDF of a screenshot, um, to show us what the amount would be. And then we implemented a cap. So we had a 200 per person per year structure. And this, especially from an organizational perspective, is really effective because we aren't purchasing something and therefore Odlin owns it. Our participants were purchasing it and then we were just subsidizing a portion of the cost. And so in your implementation policy, it's good to like people will ask questions about the specifics of what is and isn't covered and at what point in the timeline they need to provide either a quote, an invoice, or a receipt. And so just like it, as I'm explaining, I'm like, oh, that sounds like a lot of work. But in practice, we found that it was much more efficient than once we started working on it. So we announced it and then we had our participants let us know what they were thinking. And it all fit within our guidelines. So we were able to approve it and then they were able to submit the receipts, which then we processed with the finance folks at Oakland.
Hmm. Thanks, Carrie. And yeah, the other piece is like collecting a lot of feedback on the program. Oops. You want to be able to show funders and donors and others um, who are looking at this initiative that there is value to it. And so collecting, you know, doing short surveys to collect people's like how this has benefited them, also getting testimonials from them that can be shared with various stakeholders, um, you can even go as far as doing video testimonials if that's going to have an impact. We primarily focused on written testimonials, allowed people to have the option to remain anonymous. Um, and uh, and then we also did feedback surveys to collect more data on how this program benefited them, what they want to see out of it in the future. Carrie, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think a really important point was really making accessible participation tools. Often we see with organizations or employers, for example, them develop these benefits or these resources, but don't often explain how to engage in them or how to access them or how to follow up on them. And so a big part of the pilot and the feedback was like us clarifying that if how we implemented it was as effective as it existing. And so with the feedback we were receiving, um, one, we were able to keep it anonymous between our participants, but also we really wanted to engage on if they like the tools they needed to access the subsidy were also working. And so that the policy that we implemented and the procedure we implemented was also working. Because there's nothing worse than developing this whole program and then someone not knowing how to use it. And so that was also part of the feedback structure.
Mhm. Yeah, and the feedback that we did collect will help us continue to budget this in future grants, to continue to justify it to our funders, and to hopefully uh, present it to the board as something that has to be built into our operational annual expenses budget. So who's the fund for? So the fund really could be for anybody that you deem um, a good fit for the program. In this case, it could be staff, contractors, volunteers, program participants. We had an advisory council as part of this project. So we made sure to open this up to those folks since they were giving us their time. And yeah, there might be other people that you want to include in the eligibility based on who your clients or uh, the community you serve is.
Yeah, so a good example is like, say you're a labor union, you might want to implement this for your membership base or for certain caucuses or certain committees, like to be able to access. Those are volunteers, obviously, in some cases, but um, all of our organizations are so unique and different. And so, like, you might have concern about, say, someone comes just one time and you're like, am I really going to give this person a tech subsidy when they've only participated in one meeting, for example, or one event? And that's up to you. Like you get to decide what level of engagement um, is the best fit and will feel like it's fulfilling your mandates.
Yeah, and actually on that note, during the pandemic, I believe it was QP at York had a small fund for teachers' assistants and contract faculty to subsidize some of our tech needs when we shifted to online. So that's actually how these headphones got purchased. And that kind of sparked my interest in building a technology subsidy fund that is more ongoing and not just a one-time thing that people can actually use continuously. Um, yeah, so the tech subsidy can be used for a variety of different devices. Again, you can decide as an organization on what you want to fund, but this can include hardware, computers, tablets. It can include software subscriptions. So if there's a subscription that your organization relies on that people um, need to participate, that can be included. Um, it can be an internet bill or data plans. This one I find is very commonly used by folks. And other technology expenses. So, for instance, one person in our advisory council required a standing desk. So we were able to subsidize the costs and offset it for them. And that standing desk helps them better participate in the meetings that we are inviting them to. Carrie, did you have anything to add?
Um, yeah, I think one thing to think about as an organization, you might say, well, we just bought, say, an owl so that people can participate better. That's where that money went. Sure, that makes a lot of sense. We're not saying you need to do a budget amendment right now, but if you were able to purchase an owl, say for hybrid participation this year, maybe next year those funds can go into running a tech subsidy pilot. And so I would encourage folks to think about the tools as like maybe a tech subsidy comes as part of an ongoing tech accessibility commitment by your organization. So maybe you have to first in the first year or two prioritize internal tools, but the ultimate goal is to have participants engaging in those tools. So we can think about all of the different devices that people can access, but just thinking through how will this look practically for your organization. I've seen a lot in the past around like accessibility funds where organizations are quick to book like ASL interpretation, but they don't necessarily like that's not even necessarily the best way for deaf or hard hearing participants to engage. And so thinking about this in terms of like um, something that practically fits with like and so you might want to do a survey like of the people who would be participating to ask them how they access the platforms they use in your organization. So I know Slack is difficult, like struggles, for example, with older computers. If Slack is a platform you want to see increased participation on, you might need to ask folks if Slack's actually working on their phones, tablets, and computers. And so thinking through this in a practical sense so that we're seeing like tangible numbers increase in your online programming.
So this is the tech subsidy fund form that we use to that um, folks who are eligible for the program can complete to request the the subsidy. So we tried to keep it as simple as possible. We didn't want it overly complicated or in a way that would discourage folks from completing it. So we decided what was the most important information to ask for that we needed in order to distribute the funds. So we asked them to, complete their general information, but then also what they intend to use the tech subsidy fund on. So what products or subscription or bills they want to use it for. Then they would just provide us with the cost and whether or not this is for a reoccurring cost or a one-time cost. Um, and then the amount that they were requesting, we did find everybody asked for the full amount because typically their expenses were higher than the $200 that we were offering. Then they could upload a quote, screenshot, or of what they're looking to purchase or a receipt. So some people had an item that they wanted to purchase and they would screenshot that off of, let's say, Best Buy, and they would share that. And then after that, we would ask them to submit after they purchased it the final receipt before we issue the funds. Um, and then we really wanted to know what their reason was for accessing the program. This was all more for our own data collection so that we can report back to our funder on how people are using this program and how they're benefiting for it. And then we asked if they were willing to provide a testimonial on their experience, and we requested those testimonials at a later date after they've received the technology and have had time to use it for a bit. And then any additional information they wanted to provide us to support their request. Carrie, is there anything that you want to add?
Yeah, just before we move to the Q&A part, I think it's important to think about um how like you might be like, this is all great, but where are we getting the money for this? Or like how and an important thing to also think about is this is sponsorable. Like this is something that if say you can't get a grant or like you don't have charitable status to do larger grant applications, it might be worthwhile in terms of funding through a platform like Zephy or Patreon, or doing like a bit of a sponsorship campaign to be like, we want to see the same way we would pay for honorariums for speakers, we want to be able to make our organization more financially accessible. And so, with um, in each step of the way, we talked like we made sure also that the folks who were participating knew where the funding came from. Like obviously it comes from our wage grant, but I think that's the other piece is being like financially transparent around like how we're getting these funds, what we're using them for, and like that we want them to continue. Um, because we've been able to run this pilot program and get a bunch of feedback on it. As Steph mentioned at the top of the session, we do want to look at how to expand this and like continue it with our volunteers, but also like implement it with staff. And then we have to think through, are there any additional considerations for like if someone's already getting paid from your organization, adding that on top. And so each step of the way, it's been like I really like stuff that we show the form because I like all of the steps that go into this to make it like it's a lot easier to do than I think people might think.
Yeah, we invite people to like take this forum and adapt it to their own organization. I don't think you need to start from scratch. That's why we're sharing it. And it's like under for a funder, if you were to put this under honoraria, it's quite easy to justify why it's important for the participation of staff and volunteers. So like all you really need is a few sentences of an explanation explaining how it's going to benefit your team. And a lot of us, I'd say a good majority of people these days operate in a hybrid setting. So if we're going to do that and continue to do it and be inclusive about it, providing these kind of subsidies is quite essential. Um, so yeah, now we're going to move on to our Q&A and open the floor to any folks who have questions or comments. We are going to stop the recording at this point.